Ollie on email is asking the question, I see that Kingsley Coman is rumoured to be joining my beloved Arsenal. Why has a Premier League move never materialised for a player who commands so much attention? And how do you think he'd fare in the Prem?
Not particularly well, is my opinion. And I say that for one reason and one reason only. Kingsley Coman's injury history, I think, suggests that physically it might be a bridge too far for him. I also feel that Coman's in a strange stage in his career. He's won so much, and he's still got quite a few years left. But I think so much of his his appeal and what he offers on the pitch comes from the kind of the explosive turn of pace that he has. And obviously, the older he gets, sort of the less explosive that is. And it feels like for me, wherever he goes next, I think he's really going to have to look after himself as he sort of gets towards the latter stage of his career. And for me, I think a Premier League move probably would have made sense a lot earlier if he had left Bayern at after a couple of years, perhaps. But for me right now, especially in the situation he's in where he's battling against a lot of competition for his place in the French national team as well, it's almost like he got a little bit complacent after that, scoring the winning goal in the Champions League final back in 2020 against his former club PSG, of course. And it's, I feel like the next move for him is not really a particularly obvious one. I don't know if maybe Spain might be a better destination for him. Obviously, we know that he's already done Italy. I don't imagine that France appeals that much to him at this moment in time, and I don't think, given sort of where PSG are right now, that they'd be sort of in need of somebody like Coman. So it doesn't really leave too many destinations for him. So short of maybe a rebirth with Bayern and sort of re-establishing himself as an undisputed lock for a starting 11 position, I feel that the Premier League actually could be a real risk for Kingsley Coman. And I just don't know how Premier League fans would sort of take to him at this stage in his career, because I think obviously he'd come with a huge reputation, but I'm not quite sure what sort of return a Premier League club would get on their investment.
I wouldn't disagree with any of that, and I think Italy was what sprung to my mind in terms of future destinations. But I guess we can't forget with Kingsley Coman that he was very close to going to the Middle East last summer, and that would have been really the end of his European career as we know it. I think you look at him now at 28. I don't think he's the sort of player who would have come back. Really, I think if he'd have gone out to Qatar, that would have been his choice. And he sort of had a change of heart at the last minute, and I can understand him not wanting to let go of what has been a really good top-level European career. But it is the injury thing, really. It's a funny thing to say about a player who's 28 years old and has won so much, but I find it quite hard getting a handle on how good he actually is still. I know on his day, it's weird because he scored the winning goal in the Champions League final. He's had so many great moments and won so much silverware. But can you get it consistently out of him for a season? And have you ever been able to get it consistently out of him for a season? And how likely is it, the way that football is going, that he's going to find consistency in a football that's got a more and more packed calendar all the time? I think quite small. And then you're looking at a sort of deluxe substitute, really. Someone who can start some games and bring him on for other games. His future, he will not find the wages that he's currently on elsewhere in Europe. I don't think. I just don't think it's possible, because no one's going to want to take that risk. No one's going to make that investment. And I do wonder if he's very much a product of his time in a way because of that. Because he is a player that we've seen for France, that we've seen for Bayern, and he was very highly regarded at Juventus and PSG as well. That he is a guy who can turn big games. There's no doubt about that. And him scoring the winner in a Champions League final underlines that. But on the other hand, he's also a product of modern football, in that you look at that run of successive titles that was only broken when Bayern didn't win the Bundesliga last year. And there is a little bit of, if you sit in the barber shop for long enough, you're going to get a haircut about it. Because I sort of compare it a little bit to like a player who's got far less of a name. And some of our listeners might not even remember a Serbian midfielder called Ljubomir Fesa, who won titles in 9 successive seasons. So he actually won 10 in 9 seasons because he switched midway through one of those seasons from Olympiacos to Benfica. So started at Partizan Belgrade, played for Partizan, Olympiacos and Benfica. And he won 9, he was league champion 9 seasons in a row, and actually twice in one of those seasons, as I said. Now, Fesa was a very, very serviceable defensive midfielder. Was he a superstar? No. Was he elite? No. But I think that's very much the way the wind is blowing in modern football. And it's like why, for example, we've had more treble winners over the last decade and a half than when it was an achievement that was rare as hen's teeth. If you go back to the 20th century, for example, it's something that's happening more and more because you're getting an imbalance of power in football, something that Miguel Delaney talks about all the time when he's on here, that means that these runs are more and more likely. And it feels that rather than being key to all those wins, Coman has just been at those clubs a lot of the time.
What's the name of the Serbian who got the haircut eventually again?
Ljubomir Fesa, and he always had a man bun. He never got the haircut. It was very much a metaphorical haircut.
From David Simons on email, apart from an impressive period in the early 2010s, Bayern never seemed to be a real Champions League threat anymore, perhaps I should say. But nevertheless, he says they don't seem to be a real Champions League threat despite repeated Bundesliga success. Could we see that change, or are they just as at the mercy of a hotly contested cup competition? Andy?
I think it's an important definition that you make there, Dotun, because I think they're a threat. They're just not always a winner. I guess that's the nub of it, really, isn't it? I mean, if we're going all the way back, I guess it's one of the sticks that's used to beat Pep Guardiola with, and there are not too many sticks to beat him with, obviously. But I think you look at his time at Bayern, and from a distance, people will say he took over a treble-winning team, and in 3 years, he didn't win the Champions League. Now, I think that's a very, very reductive way of looking at it because, well, firstly, I think there are, he made a misjudgment tactically in the first leg against Real Madrid in 2014. But other than that, I think you look at 2015, they had a slew of injuries and still gave Barcelona a good semi-final. And then in 2016, if they played that second leg against Atletico Madrid another 100 times, I'm sure they're winning at least 99 of them. So what David says about it being a hotly contested cup competition, that is the key, really, really to it. Not always the best team wins it. I think you look at Arsenal this season, for example, have disappointed a little bit. I think it's fair to say, certainly in keeping with recent seasons in the Premier League, because people expected them to have a real go this season, especially with City not being up to the task of defending. But it feels like it would fit in quite well with English sort of football history in the Champions League, really, of Liverpool in 2005, of Chelsea in 2012, teams that have given and clubs that have given so much to the Champions League, winning it in a year when they're not actually at their best. I do feel, though, that the sea change, and I don't know what you feel about this, JJ, has been that Bayern have looked like less of a genuine contender in the last couple of years. Now, I think there are a few reasons for this. One, they've been through a couple of coaches. And you think Nagelsmann, Tuchel, and company, they felt like they've had less of a plan. There's been instability upstairs as well. You think Salihamidzic and Khan getting the elbow. So I think that's part of it. Because player-wise, they've been as equipped as they have been for a while. I think they have a good squad that a lot of clubs would like to have. But I think really, this was why the first half of this season under company is interesting. defensively, they've looked more up to it this season. I guess the other half of that, JJ, is that we talked in the main show about experience and how important that is in terms of, not just playing brilliant football all the time, but being able to see games out. I think particularly in the first half of this Champions League campaign, particularly in the group stage, I guess the criticism of Kompany having not coached at Champions League level before is the fact that away from home, starting with that Villa game, actually, they look quite vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you touched on a couple of really interesting points there. One, I would say, I think it's quite interesting to see where Bayern are now, given where they were a couple of years ago, because people forget that they were sort of the strongest club in Europe, arguably, at the time that they won the Champions League during COVID. But it was a title that not only many people tend to sort of gloss over and forget just because of the circumstances, but the Bayern themselves didn't really seem to be keen to sort of champion either, because it's almost like they won it by default. And obviously, that with their tradition, having multiple European titles, it felt like that one kind of gets, forgotten, too quickly, that they did actually win it in 2020. But I'm glad that you mentioned sort of the lack of stability upstairs at Bayern, because I feel one of the biggest factors in them sort of, I'm not going to say becoming an also-ran, because, I think that's obviously, hugely disrespectful to a club of Bayern's standing and tradition. But it kind of feels like they've taken a little bit of a step back in terms of being one of the favourites at the beginning of each kind of Champions League season, and also no longer an automatic lock for Bundesliga success, because they've started to take decisions which they don't really feel like they're done in the traditional kind of Bayern way anymore. And to your point as well about some of the experience in the team, I think it's now reaching an absolutely crucial stage, because they're starting to say goodbye, to some of the guys who have been there, essentially a part of the furniture. Thomas Müller going, and there's speculation about how much longer Manuel Neuer has with his in this Bayern career of his. I know that you and I had a separate discussion about it at Villa Park on Tuesday, and you'd be surprised to see him calling time on his career anytime soon. But it does feel like they're moving away now from some of the, I guess, the more kind of Germanic elements of their team. Goretzka's kind of been pushed out to the fringes. Kimmich was flirting with potentially leaving before extending his contract. And obviously they had to fight tooth and nail as well to keep hold of Alphonso Davies, looking at this Bayern side potentially being picked apart, where there was a moment where potentially 2 or 3 players could leave on free transfers against Bayern's will, because obviously there are players that that Bayern would like to move on. Leroy Sané, for example, who hasn't really lived up to expectations. And it just feels like this Bayern side are now in transition, but they're rebuilding themselves slightly differently to how they've been run over the last couple of decades. And you do wonder if sort of erring away from that, very distinct Bayern style of management is ultimately in hope of bridging the gap between them and some of their other continental rivals who are racing ahead of them, but also to make sure that they don't sort of forever fall behind, and sort of get lost in this chase between all the other top 5 leagues and the Premier League, to sort of bridge that gap, with English football, which, all of the other rival leagues seem to be, obsessed with doing. And it's almost like the stability that Bayern and the Bundesliga bring is not quite enough for Bayern's continental ambitions at times, which I feel has kind of informed some of these slightly surprising decisions that they've made. And that obviously has manifested itself in some very up and down performances on the pitch over the last couple of years.
Yeah, just a point of protocol. You may not have got the memo, JJ, but the rules are that what is said at Villa Park after a match stays at Villa Park, unless you want to go to our YouTube channel to hear what was said at Villa Park between Andy and JJ. It's there. Go to On the Continent.
Well, I guess the good news for the listeners then is that I don't go to Villa Park that often.
This question from the perhaps kingdom, but possibly principality of Yugopotamia. In fact, this question is from the Prince of Yugopotamia. Having only lost 1 match since December, can Strasbourg keep up their momentum and qualify for the Champions League? Could the ties to Chelsea pose an issue? More on those ties, JJ.
Yeah, so obviously being both being owned by Blueco, both being in competition for a continental berth next season, there is sort of the spectre that has been raised of both of these clubs competing at the same time and having to go through the same sort of rigmarole as we've seen with Ineos-owned Nice and Manchester United since Ratcliffe's investment in the Red Devils. And this is a similar situation, although there is a lot that can change between now and then. Strasbourg obviously still have to confirm their place in Europe, and Chelsea as well would have to ensure that they don't slip out of contention at the last minute. But it is something that sort of was always in the back of people's minds when Blueco invested in Strasbourg, which has been met with a lot of opposition in France, notably from the Alsace-based club's fans. But it's also something that's become a bit of an inevitability since Strasbourg have completely revamped their squad and become sort of one of the most vibrant, one of the youngest, and one of the best teams to watch in Ligue 1 over the last sort of season and a half, with a number of very, very talented players now added to this team. They've turned a corner a little bit under Liam Rosenior as coach, and now they're looking at potentially an improbable Champions League spot. I still feel that they'll probably fall just short of that, but maybe Europa League or Conference League. But with Chelsea not guaranteed to finish in the top 5 in the Premier League, the chances of Chelsea and Strasbourg both being in the same European competition next season, is still fairly high at this moment in time, and it's something that obviously has prompted UEFA to have to keep looking at the rules and making slight adjustments and changes. What might that mean for potentially Strasbourg next season? Should action need to be taken? Obviously, with Nice, we've seen sort of Ineos' ownership of Nice go into a blind trust. You've had other previous examples of it as well, involving French teams with Redbird's ownership of both Milan and Toulouse, when Toulouse made it into Europe. So it's sort of not without precedent, but I think sort of given, the size of the investment in Strasbourg, the number of players who have played for Strasbourg who have come sort of on loan from Chelsea as well, it's, I think the question becomes more and more pertinent with this example. So I'm absolutely fascinated to see, first of all, whether both of them end up sort of in Europe and potentially playing in the same competition, and then whether this topic raises its head again and gets debated closer to the start of next season, because it does feel now that sort of we're moving towards a point where there's probably going to have to be some kind of sizable change to the rules regarding dual ownership.
Yeah, question from Lewis, Andy, and this is nice and simple, but it's a conversation that we've had over the last few weeks. Well, not quite this conversation. We've been talking about Thiago Motta for a few weeks now, not least last week after his sacking from Juve. Where does Thiago Motta go next?
Well, as I said on OTC's YouTube channel a few weeks back when he was fired, I feel as if, even though he didn't do the perfect job at Juventus, as he didn't get the full season, to me it feels like it's more on Juventus than it is on him. He had the youngest Juventus side in recent memory, so I think you had to expect a bit of unevenness. I think for that reason, there will be plenty of jobs for him. Bear in mind, before PSG appointed Luis Enrique, they were interested in bringing him back. Now, obviously, they're not interested in him now because it's all going very, very well under Luis Enrique, and he signed a new contract in the recent past. But I think for down the line, I wouldn't rule him out at all. But of course, that depends on how he does in his next couple of jobs, because it is ideal for PSG, even though they were prepared to take him on before he had a huge level of elite level, or any level of elite level experience, because of course he did very well with Bologna, but you wouldn't quite call that an elite level. I think if he were to flop in a few jobs in between, that would definitely impact on their ability to take him in the future and their desire to take him in the future. So I think his next move is a very important one. I could see it being in Italy, definitely, because he's still got an enormous amount of credit there for what he did with Bologna. On the other hand, you have to say Vincenzo Italiano has done a great job, particularly in the second half of this season, of getting Bologna and keeping Bologna up at a level. I think you look at some of the jobs that could be available in the near future, and there's plenty. I think maybe Roma's not the obvious choice immediately, but they're always quite unstable and getting through coaches in the recent past. So you look at Roma, you look at Milan. Well, there might be an opening. Atalanta, Gasperini has said he's not going to go beyond the end of his contract in 2026. And I do wonder, JJ, if France might be a spot for him as well. I guess the question is, because it didn't really work at Juventus after a certain point, and maybe he would have turned it round if he'd have had more time. I think he had some very creditable moments. I think the team progressed a little bit under him, certainly, considering it was quite a new team and quite a young team. Had some great moments in the Champions League early on. You think of the wins against PSV, where they played very stylishly. Leipzig, away, where they came back with 10 men. I guess the thing is, now Thiago Motta has coached at elite level. People have gone from thinking, oh, he's an interesting coach with some interesting ideas, to, oh yeah, it's not quite as fluid as you might have thought. Whereas, realistically, if people watch Bologna on a regular basis last season, they'd have known that it was interesting football. It wasn't necessarily exciting football all the time.
Yeah, and I think maybe that results-based approach might appeal to some French clubs who are looking for a bit of stability in terms of where they can hope to finish in the league. But I think as well it's going to be really interesting because in the back of his mind, I assume that there will be sort of this this knowing that sort of informs his decision that he doesn't want to necessarily go somewhere where it's going to block him from potentially taking over as PSG manager in the future, but it's going to have to be a club of the right kind of stature that enables him to shine enough, to have PSG's eyes keeping an eye on what he's doing, which I actually think maybe suggests that France isn't the best destination for him. And actually, I'm going to throw a curveball out there because a lot of people forget when you think about Thiago Motta that he was actually born in Brazil and obviously made his name as an Italian international. But I think sort of with that ability to speak Portuguese, that opens up potentially going to Portugal, maybe coaching one of the big names should an opening make itself available to him. Let's not forget as well, he had a bit of his playing career in Spain with Barcelona when he was rocking much longer hair than we were used to for the majority of his career. And I do think potentially a move away from Italy is actually probably beneficial for him, as much as France is the obvious destination from his time at PSG. Also there is a possibility, I guess, if we are really sticking with France as an idea for a destination of, if Adi Hütter, for example, was to move on from Monaco because it's been a bit bumpy over the second half of the season, maybe somewhere like that where I don't think sort of the domestic rivalry between Monaco and PSG would really stop that move from potentially happening, and maybe that gives him the kind of right level in order to potentially compete at the top end of the table with PSG, but also regularly be competing in Europe. But to me, I do think that certainly in his position at the moment, looking to potentially see if there's an opening maybe in Portugal or what might be going into Spain, that could also make a bit of sense for Motta.
When you're throwing Spain out there, I wonder if one of his former clubs, say if Atletico got themselves into a post-Simeone situation eventually, you think he'd make a pretty good Atletico coach, or at least an interesting Atletico coach?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that he has he kind of has the personality for that. I think... he himself as a player was fascinating because when he first signed for PSG, I only really knew Motta as the kind of proverbial shithouse playing for Inter who, would be trying to get players yellow and red carded or getting himself yellow and red carded. And, I essentially thought he was, pretty much a cruncher up until he came in for PSG, and then you realise there's a completely different aspect to his game, and his reading of the game. He is an extremely smart football operator, perhaps a little too smart. And some of his interviews where he's talked about sort of tactics over the last couple of years have certainly raised a few eyebrows. But I do think that there is a very high level coach there waiting to be unearthed. And I think it takes experiences at different clubs as well and things not quite working out. And I do think that's probably what PSG are also waiting for, to see, how he reacts after his first few sort of significant postings before deciding whether he is potentially, the right material to take over from somebody like a Luis Enrique. But to your point, it's going to be very, very difficult taking over post Diego Simeone for anyone, as it was at Arsenal post Arsene Wenger. And I think from Motta's point of view, as much as it might be a good fit, might also be a hiding to nothing, because following in those kind of footsteps can be really, really complicated. And can tarnish your reputation, as Unai Emery saw with Arsenal, and he's been working, for the last couple of years, both with Villarreal and Villa, to sort of rebuild his reputation after that. So I do think that there is quite an elevated level of jeopardy regarding where Motta potentially goes next.
Yeah, and if there are any other unemployed coaches out there who would like some advice, and also to consider any openings in the footballing world, you know where to come. On the continent, ask OTC, we'll have the answers. Tim, or Go Away Tim, asks, could Oliver Burke solve Scotland's attacking worries now that he's fulfilling his potential at Bremen, Andy?
Bloody right, he could.
Ooh.
He's been great of late. And look, I think everyone's looked at Ollie Burke for a while and thought, the talent's there, why can't he settle anywhere? And funnily enough, having been out on loan a couple of times, he's come back to Werder Bremen, who are not a club with enormous resource. And very much as JJ was mentioning in the Portuguese league before, one of the things that happens in Portugal a lot is players who you think are done at a club come back and do well because they're just recycled out of financial necessity, really. And I guess this is kind of what's happened with Ollie Burke, the fact that, they've not had an enormous amount of options, and he's ended up giving another go after going back to Millwall on loan, for example. And in the last couple of months, he's been pretty good. Now, look, we can talk about him finally fulfilling his potential. It's still early in that. And of course, he's not a young man anymore. So there's an opportunity to be seized. At the moment, he's seizing it. And we're seeing, I think, all the raw qualities that we've always known he had being applied in the correct way under Ole Werner. And I think Werner is a coach who really likes him, clearly, who's given him his best chances at Werder Bremen. And in recent weeks, we've been seeing the fact that Burke is not the wide player that we originally thought he was, but actually a centre forward. He's best there. He's quick. He's great in the air. He's a really, really cool finisher. All of those sort of things that really a club like Werder Bremen, in the position that they're in, cannot afford to go out and buy. They can't afford to go out and buy a top-class centre forward, really. So it's about getting someone who didn't work out elsewhere. So like Marvin Duksch, for example, who's been great for them. He's a player that didn't quite break through at Borussia Dortmund, that had a few little opportunities and wasn't able to establish himself there. And Burke is the next on that line. But when you look at his ability to lead the line and his technical quality, yes, he could be absolutely great for Scotland. But when we look at how comparative this is, I think it's worth underlining that after his most recent goals, he's got to 5 goals for the Bundesliga season. It's the most he's ever scored in a league season. 5 league goals, which is remarkable when you think of his talent, when you think of the fact that he's heading into his late 20s. So look, nothing is yet won, as the French would say. He needs to carry on like this. And I think when you look at the options Scotland have got, he clearly benefits from that extra responsibility. Yes, they should definitely get him in the squad. And look, I hope he continues to roll and roll like this, because when he's playing well, he's great to watch.
It's now time for our Game of the Week, brought to you by FotMob. Each week, our experts recommend a game for you to watch at the weekend. And just as importantly, they also suggest the food that we should be having with it. Andy, you're going for Bologna versus Inter on Sunday, 5 p.m. our time. And I read on FotMob that Inter are the second highest ranked Serie A team away from home this season. Does that tell us how this match might end?
I think it tells us some of it. I think Inter got a really important win and quite a hard fought win against Cagliari, one of the weaker teams in the division last weekend. They've just gone through an incredibly hard week. They put everything into that tie with Bayern. And I think the efforts they had to make to get past Cagliari, even though they changed some of the players, of course, Marko Arnautovic had a big influence in that game, scoring and assisting, getting a kick up the backside on the touchline for a very mischievous Marcus Thuram as well. I think that underlines where Inter are at the moment, that they're in control of Serie A. But with Napoli winning on Monday, they're still only 3 points in front. And they're going to have to rotate quite judiciously if they're going to get through this. Now, look, Bologna have been on a brilliant run. They lost and were outplayed at Atalanta last weekend. So they're well in the mix for the Champions League spots as well. I think this is quite a hard one for Inter, and it's probably the last one they want in a week in which they've had a go in the Champions League. Now, look, FotMob has a head-to-head record on the website and on the app, and they've said that there's not been a goalless game between these two since August 2010. So we're hoping for a bit of bang. Of course, Arnautovic, who I think will start, is going back to his former club. So there's a bit of spice there. One thing FotMob hasn't underlined to us is the fact that Bologna has the best food in Italy. It's amazing.
Yeah.
But obviously, if you've not been there before, you're going to have to try a spaghetti bolognese from Bologna, right?
You would have to, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and
it's a given.
They've got the oldest university in Italy, so you can go there and eat your bolognese. It's in the name, in the job description, Bologna. Well done. And JJ, you've gone for Saint Etienne versus Lyon on Sunday at 7:45 for us to watch. FotMob broke down Lyon's record recently, their recent form at least, and they've scored 11 goals in their last 4 Ligue 1 games. But Saint Etienne keeper Gauthier Lassonnière is ranked 3rd in the league for saves per match. So where does that leave us?
Yeah, well, nothing better than Derby Day, and this is sort of as big as they come, really, with everything that's on the line. Saint Etienne battling against relegation, really in need of the points now, and Lyon chasing potentially a top 3 spot, if not at least a place in the top 4 and Champions League qualification. And it feels like it's really going to be an acid test now for OL's ambitions of potentially getting themselves back into Europe. At the time of recording, obviously, we're not sure if Lyon's European adventure will continue past their date with Manchester United at Old Trafford on Thursday night. And it feels like this is potentially one of those really tricky games for Lyon, because Saint-Etienne, they need something that's going to break them out of this funk. Otherwise, they're going to remain in the bottom 2, which are both automatic relegation positions. I think at this moment in time, without a reverse in form, it's difficult to see them being able to finish much higher than the relegation playoff places. So, this one is absolutely key, I think, for them to, if not win, then at least to avoid defeat. And Larsonneur, one of the guys in the Saint-Etienne squad who absolutely relishes, this kind of occasion, the needle that a derby brings. And actually, I picked this game not necessarily because it's one of France's leading derby fixtures and the passion is almost unrivaled across the country, but so I could flex my cultural muscles. And I think Saint-Etienne as a city, as a destination, gets a bit of a bad rap. People sort of dismiss it as being fairly boring, nothing much to do there except for when you're going to watch a game at Le Chaudron. But I am going to go for my food pick of a râpé stéphanoise, which is essentially a potato rosti, which is sort of specific to their region in the way that they do it. Goes well with meat, goes well with a nice dry wine as well. And, I think it's the ideal kind of munching food, before a game like this. And, hopefully the combination is makes for good entertainment this weekend.
It sounds like you're having a heavy weekend on the food, Dotun. Drink plenty of water.
Very good advice.